So, hi everyone. It is Talk Back. It's February 14th, Valentine's Day. I hope there's a lot of love to go around, but I have to tell you, I'm worried about our country. And I have a perfect guest to help me talk about it also today. And so I'm questioning, do you want to live in a country where our teachers are being harassed, threatened, facing death threats, all because they are teaching the uncomfortable truths about our history to our children? Do you want to live in a country where we have an election and politicians refuse the peaceful transfer of power and lie about our elections? What is going on? And how can history help us with this? Let me introduce Professor Manisha Sinha, who is the Draper Chair at the University of Connecticut here in our own state. Hi, Manisha. It's so good to have you here today.
Hello, Sheila. Thank you for having me.
Okay, and what I want to tell people about is that you have such a wonderful perspective because of your background. It has given you a unique look at our American experience because of your background. So I think before we go into all of your other great accomplishments that you've had and the award-winning books that you've written and that you're going to write, I want you to tell us about your background growing up in India. Talk about that.
Yes, so I actually was born and brought up in India, and I came to the United States when I was 21. So I imagine I have a typical immigrant story because now I have lived in this country longer than I did in my own native country in India. I came here to graduate school to study American history because I was born in a family where, everyone was interested in history. My father wrote a lot of military history. He joined the British Indian Army during the Second World War. My sisters and brothers, we all majored in history. My sister's also a professor. And so I guess that was the main topic of conversation in our dinner table growing up in India. It was all about history. When I came to the United States, I specifically wanted to study, the histories of race, democracy, and citizenship in the U.S. because in India we had decolonized from the British Empire, and these issues, I think, have a global significance. So I came here to study American history. I went to graduate school here, got my PhD, met my husband, got married, and just stayed on. And I have been in the United States, specifically teaching in New England now, I think for nearly 30 years.
What I think, um, what I what I think is so what I think is so interesting about your background and what you've described and things I've read about you is that, of course, from India, you had the British colonialism before India got its independence, and you had the great uh, politician, humanitarian Mahatma Gandhi, who organized protests, nonviolent protests, and that was a model in many ways for Martin Luther King. And so when you came to America, some of the same values and processes that we used in India to help gain independence were used by Martin Luther King. And so how did that experience of your Indian heritage and the history of that revolution, peaceful power, how did that compare to your studies here? And what grabbed you about it? What made it attractive to you to study?
Question because those were exactly the kinds of issues that attracted me to studying U.S. history. I was born in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, was aware that Dr. King had used Mahatma Gandhi's notion of nonviolent protests and the search for truth, satyagraha, and was very influenced by it. In fact, Dr. King visited India um, and was very influenced by the Indian system of what we call reservations and what is called affirmative action here for what was designated in the Indian constitution as scheduled castes and tribes who had been discriminated against in the past. So there were a lot of parallels, I would say, between the Indian struggle for independence and decolonization and the Black freedom movement in this country. And in fact, the people who led those two movements were aware of it and were in contact with each other. There's correspondence between Nehru, India's first prime minister, and W.E.B. Du Bois, the great Black intellectual and activist, and that pretty much continues until the 60s. And I was interested, of course, in looking at these connections, and I worked my way back to the history of slavery, where it all began, in my opinion. And now I am going to sort of point out something that's interesting. We all know that Dr. King got his ideas of nonviolent protest from Mahatma Gandhi, but I found it out that Mahatma Gandhi actually was influenced by American abolitionists and by American writings on civil disobedience and nonviolence, especially Henry David Thoreau's writings that came to him through Leo Tolstoy, and also of non-resistant pacifists like the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who also influenced Tolstoy. So you know what goes around comes around. And I ended up writing a bit about this in my last book on the history of abolition, the Slave's Cause.
Right. And so I loved your comment that there is no success in a future without understanding the past. And so history from the past helps us explain what's happening today. And what's happening today is really tough because, as a professor of history and someone who has written an award-winning book about the slave's cause, a history of the abolition movement, you have been a target because you have spoken out about our history education today, and you've spoken out about politics. Can you talk about that, please?
Yes, I'll be happy to. You know, I always thought of myself as just an academic historian. Most of my books were geared towards, writing for other historians and students of history, looking at the causes of the Civil War and the ways in which slavery affected national and sectional politics in this country. But with my second book, which is somewhat of a big book, that book seemed to have had a crossover appeal to a broader audience. It was reviewed widely in the mainstream press, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and it somehow resonated with people. And I found myself called upon to write articles and op-eds trying to understand our present through the lens of history. You know, how did we get here? I think history is really important for civic education. In order to be a good American citizen, one ought to know the history of the United States. There's no way that one can even make an informed political decision, I think, without knowing about our past and knowing how to get to the future. So I started writing, articles for mainstream outlets. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a piece for CNN. It was a solicited piece when Trump met with Putin and sort of went against NATO and our own allies and supported Putin's positions. And I was asked by CNN that has it ever happened in American history that a president of the United States would side with its enemies rather than its friends? And I wrote a pretty innocuous piece comparing Trump to Andrew Johnson, who was the Southern president who succeeded Lincoln when Lincoln was assassinated. And Johnson tried to fritter away the gains of the Civil War. He allowed Southerners and those who had fought against the Union to come back into power. He was very unsympathetic to the agenda of Black citizenship and establishing a republic with a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln had put it. So it was just a comparison piece, literally saying, yes, it has happened where we've had a president who has sided with the enemies of the republic rather than the Republic. And that piece in CNN went viral. It was their most downloaded article, which they told me was the first time it had happened because usually their news article, their breaking news articles get downloaded more. And I guess, it was a mixed blessing for me because even though it was widely read, it was also read by people who were very upset that I had made that comparison. I got a lot of emails. Some were respectful, some were rather crude. Those I don't bother to respond to those kinds of messages. Um, but I also got a death threat in my home, and it was a person who phoned me and said, I'm coming and I'm going to come and kill you. And that really freaked me out because I've never had such an experience. I mean, it seemed as if I was in a movie or something. And he was like, he read out my home address and he says, I know where you live and I'm coming right now to kill you. And I was all alone at home. My husband was teaching; he's a philosopher. He's also a professor, and my sons were in school. So I immediately called 911. And I live in a very small New England town, and the police chief came to my house. The entire police force was at my house in seconds because I live very close to the town center, and my neighbors all came rushing in. And I have to give credit to my local police in Massachusetts. They tracked this man down. They got a warrant from to search, because the in the call ID there was no name coming up, but they got it through the phone company, and there was this man. I know his name. I know his address too now, and he lives in Texas. And he pretended as if he was right outside my house, but actually he was nowhere near me. But it was still a scary incident for me. My husband didn't like it. My children were very, very upset. The police put cameras on my driveway. They asked me to get an order against him, not a restraining order. I think there's another term for it, where he and they have an outstanding warrant for him that if he ever comes to Massachusetts, he'll be arrested. But it meant that if I went to Texas, which I did after that for a couple of lectures, I was given security detail, personal security detail, and one of my personal security detail persons told me that this person was quite a bad apple and had outstanding warrants in a number of states. And those are the kinds of things that can really scare you. And CNN also did a very good job of monitoring the dark web to see if this person had put out my name and information about me. And I thought I'd step back now from writing those kind of public pieces because I didn't want to endanger myself and particularly not my family. But my husband, who's German, told me absolutely not. He says, don't let them quiet you because this is exactly what the Nazis did. They scared everyone into submission. People were complicit and they didn't speak up. And look at the enormity of not doing that. So he insisted that I continue writing for the public, which I did, but I did take a break for a few months because it alarmed me. Yukon was informed, and of course, my department and the Yukon police was informed because they knew that this person knew that I worked here. And nowadays, with the crazy gun laws in this country, anyone can go anywhere and have a mini massacre. So a lot of people were affected because of this man's thoughtlessness, and so it was a strange incident, and I realized that unfortunately in Trump's America that was happening more and more to a lot of people, journalists. Now we see teachers, but election officials, people getting death threats, people being intimidated and harassed in their homes. These are all marks of an authoritarian regime. They do not belong in a country like the United States that has a representative government and democratic governance. And I really think we should really make all attempts to make sure that the rule of law is enforced in this country and that we are not into the slippery slope of authoritarianism.
Yeah, I was so moved by that, and I want to read what you wrote in an article that talked about this because, as you said, We don't want teachers, academicians. We don't want academic freedom ruined. We don't want people to be afraid to go out into the political world and express their ideas. And the fact that all of this is putting a chill and people are afraid and people are not wanting to run for public office because of the harassment and the threats that they get. This is a terrible mark on our democracy. But I think what you said, I want to repeat what you wrote or said in the article. As an immigrant, naturalized citizen, I actually do love living in the United States, despite the fact that I study the history of slavery and now racial terror after the Civil War. I feel invested in the project of American democracy. Otherwise, I would not write. That we now again live in an age where violent intimidation is becoming the norm is horrifying. And I think that expresses it all. You still have the courage to go out and speak. You're telling us about it today, and I hope it reverberates. But let's talk about others, what's happening in our schools, in our school boards, where parents are coming and physically assaulting, yelling at teachers, threatening their children because they're trying to teach about, as I call it, the uncomfortable truths in American history about slavery, about the Indians, and even about the lesbian and gay community here in America. Um, Tell us about your thoughts about all these laws that are being passed now to stop the teaching of, especially what they call CRT, which is a concept, but not something that's taught to our elementary school kids.
Yes, I think it's really unfortunate that people have politicized the teaching of the histories of slavery and its long legacies, or the history of racism in this country. I do think that if you're a true patriot, you should understand that many times being a patriot means correcting your country's flaw and not being a jingoist, my country, right or wrong. People often forget that Abraham Lincoln began his political career by criticizing the Mexican War as a land grab for slavery. What would they call Lincoln, I wonder? Not patriotic for being a dissenter and for opposing his government's warlike policies at that time. I think it's really important for us to understand what is going on right now. This is an artificial issue that has been created to sow racial divisions. Playing the race card is an old and dirty trick in American politics. They did it with Lincoln. When he stood for re-election in 1864, they called him Abraham Africanus the First for abolishing slavery, or at least issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. They invented the word miscegenation to talk about the fact that emancipation would lead to black men marrying white women and your daughters and wives, which is exactly what they said during the civil rights movement, as if the demand for political equality would result in something like that automatically. And even if it did, that is an individual decision. So I think this tactic of fear mongering around racism is very old, and people do it to divide. People do it to win political power, but it's a dangerous thing to do, and it's a highly unpatriotic thing to do, because instead of uniting the country, it sows divisions in our country. And I think nothing could be more authoritarian than banning books, burning books, again, something that the Nazis did, right? Burning books, literature that they deemed um, uh, were um, were not good, or that they saw as impure for one reason or another, and obscene. Exactly the terms that are being used today. I think this movement is not a movement of a majority of decent parents. It's a politically motivated movement, and they put these are the loudest voices. If you think about all the people who continue to deny the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential elections, they are not a majority, but they are a loud minority. And clearly, these parents have been set up to do this. The idea that you should actually, by law, teach only, quote, patriotic history is also absurd. There is no standard or norm that one, of course, you should get your facts right. But history is all about changing interpretations, and it's about, reckoning with the past in the broadest way possible. So this notion that you can kind of lay down the line on what history is actually rather ahistorical. The second thing I would say is that this notion that we shouldn't make students feel uncomfortable because of their race, which sounds actually quite legitimate to me on the face of it, is also a strange argument that is being used to prevent the teaching of slavery and abolition and the war and its long afterlives. Because why would a white American student today identify with slaveholders? Why wouldn't they identify with white abolitionists or white civil rights activists? Identify with the heroes of American democracy, not those who committed treason against the country in order to uphold human bondage. These are complicated stories. Even the stories of the founding fathers is a complicated one. Yes, many of them were slaveholders, but very few of them defended slavery as a positive good, as Southern slaveholders did on the eve of the Civil War. So we should tell those complicated stories. And I think our students are ready for it. Otherwise, history is very boring. And it is kind of authoritarian to say, you can teach this and you can't teach that. It violates and not just academic freedom, but the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech and expression in this country. A lot of these super patriots think they're upholding the Constitution, but they really know nothing about the Constitution and cannot even tell you what it contains. Because if they knew the Constitution, they would know that what they are doing is not just unpatriotic, it's unconstitutional also. Critical race theory is just a bugbear that people have developed for political and racially divisive goals. Critical race theory is a legal theory that is taught in law schools, and it is meant to explore why racial inequalities in law enforcement, in particular, persist even after the civil rights movement established equal voting rights, which is now again under threat, unfortunately, and equal civil rights for African Americans in this country. That's something that lawyers need to know about. It's not something that is taught in school, but critical race theory sounds scary, right? It's all about race, and somehow that is, quote, anti white. And actually, it isn't. It's just an exploration. I think we are all humanists. And those people who constantly keep raising race and sow racial divisions in our country are the people, in fact, ironically, who have made up this manufactured controversy over critical race theory and who are now trying to legislate what can be taught in our schools and what cannot be taught in our schools.
So, Manisha, I want to go back almost 60 years to when I was a history teacher in Massachusetts during the civil rights movement in the late 60s, showing my students film strips of Martin Luther King's March on Washington, exposing them to Langston Hughes and the culture, Black culture of poetry, um, and Black history, and getting criticized by my principal and getting parents who were complaining that I was too liberal. But Manisha, that's over 60 years ago. And my question to you as a historian is, I always think of, or we are taught to think of American history as an upward movement toward more justice, toward more equality. Yes, there are setbacks along the way, but in general, Manisha, the trajectory is up and onward, getting rid of slavery, getting equal rights, changing the Constitution to give Blacks the vote, to give women the vote, to give young people the vote, and so on. So many different ways that we make progress in America. And so, my question to you is based on my experience and my ideal that we keep moving upward and onward and achieving more progress. Is that not true anymore? Is it possible that America can be going in a downward trajectory? with the kind of anti-intellectualism and the teachers being cowed. I mean, I couldn't imagine. I was 21 years old. I couldn't imagine myself being a teacher today and not at least trying to have the courage to speak out. And I see so many teachers being cowed and being harassed and being told what and how to teach. So help me out with that question.
That's $1 million question, Sheila. People keep saying, "Oh, history repeats itself," and well, usually it doesn't repeat exactly the same way. Or that are we actually going backward now? And when the events of the last few years have unfolded, things have happened in the United States that many people could not imagine seeing happening. A sitting president trying to subvert an election and not accept its legitimacy and encouraging his followers to do so. Having teachers being told what they can teach and what they cannot teach. These kinds of laws and this kind of we didn't think it was possible. And I remember somebody else asking me, what is America? A lot of people said in reaction to what has happened, well, this is what America really is. This has always been the case. And others who see it more like you do, seeing it as a story of continually expanding freedoms. And I must say that progress has not just happened on its own. It's as if everything was perfect in the founding, and then it just like always progressed in a linear, progressive fashion. It was because of the struggles of ordinary American citizens who spoke up, whether it was abolitionists in the 19th century or civil rights activists in the 20th century. And they fought against entrenched political power. They fought against reactionary and traditional attitudes very bravely, as you did, Sheila, both as a teacher and even when you went down south. Many people, many idealistic college students did go down south and join the Black freedom struggle begun by Black people themselves. African Americans have always struggled for their rights, both during slavery and beyond. So my position was a little different than those people who reacted to all this, saying, "Oh, this is what America is. America was always, yes, of course, there was slavery. They dispossessed Native Americans. They had an empire where they ill-treated people, in contrast to our higher democratic ideals. During the Cold War, we did things in other countries that were horrible, including overthrow of democratically elected regimes. But I'm not. I don't think that America is all bad and America is all good. I think the project of American democracy has always been contested, and there have always been people who fought for it and those who tried to destroy it or undermine it. And if you look at the struggle over slavery before the Civil War, you can see that. If you look at the establishment of the Jim Crow system, where the South that had lost the war won the peace and managed to establish a regime of racial terror and apartheid in the South, which became a model for South Africa and fascists in Europe in the 20th century, including Hitler. We all know that, right? We think about this long, sorry history. We know that there have been elements in our history who have always fought against the American experiment. So I see it more as a contestation. It's a very hard fought one. And sometimes things can go backwards. I mean, I just finished a book on the Reconstruction period immediately after the Civil War, where you had these three amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which established, national equal citizenship before the law for everyone, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. These were amazingly progressive amendments. They have yet to be implemented fully. If we implement them today, we could actually lessen the representation of those states that are passing vote suppression laws today in Congress, because that's part of the 14th Amendment. We could prohibit those who have tried to incite an insurrection against the government of the United States from ever holding office again. We could actually implement those parts of the 14th Amendment. But of course, we know that the South completely flouted them. for nearly a century till the civil rights movement. So I think every progress that we've had in American democracy has been because of the hard fight of outstanding American citizens and leaders in order to help to reach that goal of of a republic that actually lives up to the ideals that it was founded on. And this is a contest that is going on even today. A lot of people are very disheartened and they're pessimistic. On my own story, but I look at enslaved people who fought much greater odds and won against much greater odds eventually. So yeah, I would say the American democracy is a contested project. I wouldn't give up hope. I think Americans should continue to fight for the ideals that are being challenged today.
Thank you. So another question that I find interesting: legislation. We can legislate behavior, but we can't always legislate people's feelings, people's thoughts, people's beliefs. And so the question comes up: why do we still have so many disparities in education and employment, uh, in all aspects of life, even though we've passed the civil rights laws, we've passed anti-discrimination laws in housing and in employment and in all other avenues of life? So how do we address that issue? That this is what the right wing will tell us. They will say, well, we already passed the law. We're not a racist country anymore. You can't say that. We have laws against this, that, and the other, and we're following that. And you're racist for bringing it up, for teaching this critical race theory. We've passed that, and we're now a post-racial country. But do you get my, maybe I'm not asking the question as well as I would like to. Do you get the idea that although we have these laws, Manisha, we still have people flouting the laws, and we still have a tremendous amount of discrimination in this country?
Again, that's a very good question. And it's odd that the people who most oppose these laws are the ones who are pointing to them and saying, oh, we do not have racial discrimination anymore. Because the fact of the matter is that when the Voting Rights Act was passed, and the Civil Rights Act was passed, 1964, 1965, when Brown v. Board of Education, the decision took place to integrate schools, there was a lot of resistance to it. In the South, it became an attack on the public school systems, where people just went into private academies, all white private academies. The South did not even have a public school system until Reconstruction. When the Reconstruction, those interracial governments in which former slaves participated established the public school system that benefited not just Black people, but poor white Southern people too. The problem is that these are the people who point to these achievements and say, it's all done. And they're the ones who have opposed them the most. They have gutted the Voting Rights Act, for instance. The Supreme Court's decision in Shelby versus Holder has opened the floodgates to voter suppression in the South once again. And the South is back in form, suppressing the Black vote, whether it is making voting very difficult, removing ballot boxes, every legal and political trick in the book, gerrymandering districts, they're doing it. Recently, the decision of the Supreme Court in the Alabama case, it was so bad that even Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the Shelby versus Holder decision, dissented with the liberal judges because, as another federal court once put it, they have tried to prevent Black people from voting with virtually surgical precision. With surgical precision, they go after people, not just African Americans, young people, college students, anyone who would vote against them. A one party state is what the South was. It was solidly South. It was full of those Dixiecrats, those Southern Democratic racists who then migrated to the Republican Party after the Civil Rights Movement. We don't want to go back. That's not a democratic society. A one party state is the Soviet Union, where you don't have any opposing party, or communist China today. That's not the United States. But unfortunately, that is what they're trying to do right now. They are attacking our democracy. Also, I would mention that one can have formal legal and political equality, but the centuries of discrimination, of racist discrimination, have impacted African Americans in particular very badly. The fact that they have achieved anything in those dismal conditions is actually rather praiseworthy. Not being given access to equal education till very late, and even today, in terms of resources and the way in which desegregation was implemented, they still get the short end of the stick. If you are a black person, a person of color, and certainly a poor person in this country, you do not have the equality of opportunity. Even though we have the sort of legal fiction that, yes, everyone's equal. And as I said, even those rights are under attack right now. The long history of slavery and segregation has meant, you can see this in the statistics that you pointed out in your question, the huge racial disparities and gaps in wealth, in income, in property holding, in access to resources. These are some things that economists and sociologists have studied and have pointed out to repeatedly in the United States. And this inequality, it is a class inequality, it's a racial inequality, and it is something that the country must meet. Because even the founders of the American Republic said that a republic cannot be successful if there are huge inequalities in it. They thought of inequalities as something that happened in Europe, the old world monarchies with their aristocracies. They wanted to, as Thomas Paine put it, create the world anew, create a republic which would do away not just with political inequality, but also have a broad based equality. That is what they said makes a citizen of a republic independent and virtuous, is that they are not dependent or beholden to anyone, that they have a certain economic independence. Those are very old ideas from the 18th century. So I'm not saying something that is new. The right is very quick to say, "Oh, socialism, oh, communism," even though communist China, the Soviet Union is no longer in existence, and the right today has become a big fan of Putin, even at the cost of defending their own country, which is highly ironic. But these are old American ideals. These are old American Republican with a small r ideals. And I think we need to address them because, as some of the greatest theorists of democracy have said, a country is as powerful and as good as its meanest, its worst citizens.
So, Manisha, now I want to, before we close with some slides that I have, I want to ask you if after this show, if you would come back for another show to talk more specifically about your books and the history of slavery, abolition movement, and Reconstruction. Would you do that on another show? I would love that.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Sheila.
Okay, so I want to finish our discussion now with something that you wrote way back in November of 2020, a year ago, right after the election, which was November 3rd. On November 10th, there was an article in the paper because in those 7 days, Trump was making noises about not accepting the election, about trying to overturn it in different ways. That thought was kind of just beginning to percolate, and a newspaper columnist wanted to write an article, and he asked many academicians and people like you, is Trump, do we have a coup here, a COUP? Well, that was over a year ago, and that was 2 months before January 6th. And most of the respondents in that article said, well, not really, it's not a coup yet. And you wrote, and I'm going to read this to you because I think it's amazing how prescient you were in predicting this. You wrote, Trump's refusal to concede in the recent presidential election, enabled by the Republican Party leadership, does feel like a slow moving coup. You said that before the insurrection. You said the question is whether our institutions and electoral processes are strong enough to withstand this assault on democracy. Make no mistake, if Republicans in Washington, D.C. think they can get away with it, they would support Trump in an all out coup, as they have done before through allegations of treason and corruption. Well, are you going to give yourself credit for making that statement? And when you said that, Manisha, how did you feel when January 6th came along? Did everything you said come true?
Thank you for reading that back to me, Sheila. I had forgotten about it. And, I'm kind of glad that I said that because I think I was taken aback that Trump refused to concede the elections in the first place. And to me, it felt like a slow moving coup. And I didn't like that. It felt very un American to me. But even after saying that, I have to say that January 6th came as a shock to me when I saw those people, which was like a barbaric assault on our capital, the things that they did, the Confederate flag, which as a Civil War historian galled me, the Confederate flag that had never dared made its appearance in Washington, D.C. throughout the years of the Civil War had made its appearance in the Capitol. And the very next day, I was interviewed in Democracy Now! About the January 6th coup, and I saw myself, I sort of replayed that into, and I, like most American citizens, even though I, sort of knew the history of this country of violent opposition to government, especially during Reconstruction, when white supremacists and racist terror groups simply invaded city governments and other places to try to overthrow democratically elected governments. It had happened before in the United States, and I knew about it because I was writing about it at that time. But even for me, for someone who's so steeped in that history, January 6th came as a shock because I was like, this cannot be happening. How is it that this happens? I had not imagined in my wildest of dreams ever that this country would elect an African American president, and it did. But then I also saw the racist backlash to Obama's election and the way the Republican Party has used that racist backlash to win political power in very cynical ways in this country. But despite all that, it came as a bit of a shock to me. And I felt at that time that these people should be punished to the highest extent of the law. And not only them, but people in Congress who were in cahoots with them, people who knew what was happening or who left doors open and who facilitated that attack in a body that they were serving, a lot like the Confederates, whom they admire so much. They should be punished. So I'm hoping that the January 6th Commission gets to the heart of the matter. Every day we hear worse things, right? Trump is far more directly involved in the attempt to overthrow the elections. The fact that he imagined that he could even use the military or servile Republican office holders to do that, which is exactly what the Republican Party now is doing at the state level, overturning election laws, trying to win over state election bodies, trying to make sure that legislatures, rather than the American people, can decide which state has voted for which presidential candidate. These are all serious attacks on our democracy. They're being green lighted by a Supreme Court that is partisan, extreme, and right wing, which does not uphold the Constitution even the way they're supposed to. I think these are serious times for us to really take that into account. And the only time that I can think this happened before was when slaveholders did that, when they tried to bend the law, the Constitution, the Republic itself to their will. And then they had to be defeated in a long drawn out war. I hope we don't reach that stage. I hope that we are alert enough to these attacks on our democracy that we are able to prevent it. But I would say take it all as seriously as real authoritarian anti-democratic attacks. Again, my friends in Germany are the ones who tell me that they can't believe this is happening in America. It seems like 1930s Germany, or some it's not as bad as that clearly right now, but If history takes place first as a tragedy or a farce. I think we are living through the farcical period of the rise of the authoritarianism in the United States.
Well, you're talking about Germany. I can see that, but you see that in America when you're talking to people who are not as tuned in, let's say, as I may be, or you are certainly, to what's happening politically. Americans are going about their lives, trying to make a living, trying to educate their kids. And if when you say to them, be careful, we're falling into an authoritarian state, and this coup that you said was a slow moving coup is still really ongoing now. And we're having a difficult time bringing Trump and his people to account. We really are. A lot of people are worrying about, people who care about it are saying, wow, are we ever going to hold him accountable? And then the rest of the population is saying that could never happen. This is America. I mean, whether I vote or I don't vote, no big deal. It's not, this is just America. So we have a lot of work to do. And we're going to stay tuned, and we're going to have you back to talk about your books. And I want to learn more about the slavery, the abolition movement, and now you're writing about Reconstruction. And I know you have parallels from those days to now. But before we go, I just collected some images of you and your books and your family that I want to just show in these last few minutes that we have. Okay? All right. So I'm putting up the, can you see that, Manisha?
I can. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So just again, here you are. Um, you have a PhD in history and a professor, and you've taught at the UMass Amherst. You've had many fellowships and many honors throughout your life, many awards, and we will talk about that more with your books. And here's a lovely photo. Here you are in your office. Uh, is that little boy on the left, does he belong to you, maybe?
Yes, that's my youngest son. He
Yeah,
was,
I thought so. I was just wondering, everybody, I thought, well, this is your office. This is where you kind of live and work, right?
that's
And um,
Massachusetts. Uh,
yeah, I thought that was a good photo. And here you are again, with images from The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. That's your award-winning book, which is great. Um, who is that behind you in those photos?
um, so that's W.E.B. Du Bois, who, I taught at the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro American Studies. He was a great Black intellectual, founder of the NAACP, one of the founders of the NAACP, a person who was born in Massachusetts, one of the first Black graduates from Harvard University, and a great intellectual, come activist, a Renaissance man who did everything. He edited a newspaper, wrote some of the most influential books on Black life and history, and was an activist, and eventually died in the 1960s in Ghana when, during the McCarthy period, he was hounded out of the country.
Okay, and the woman on the right behind you?
I think that is. I don't think that is Shirley Graham Du Bois. I think that could be Augusta Savage. Because we had a gallery called the Augusta Savage Gallery. She was a Black artist and sculptor, and I think that is her.
Nice. And just an example, you've spoken at symposiums, um, at the Newberry History Organization, and so on. We'll get into that when we talk about your book. Here's the cover of your book, a full history of the men and women who truly made us free. Um, and we'll talk about that in our next show. And again, here you are in a panel talking about William Still's courageous life. Just a sentence or so on who William Still was.
So William Still was a Black abolitionist who ran and was the secretary of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, a very important staff in the Black in the abolitionist network as a whole. He wrote the first book on the Underground Railroad in the 1870s, where he literally documented the hundreds of men and women who had voted with their feet, escaped slavery. So he literally invented the field of the study of the Underground Railroad.
Oh,
And it was, it's popular history. A lot of people talk about the Underground Railroad today, about Harriet Tubman and others. But many academic historians sort of dismiss that as the realm of myth, that this was not proper history as such. And in my book, The Slave Scores, and you showed both the hardcover, which is in black, the paperback, which is in white. I think the hardcover is all sold out, but you can still get it in paperback and then as an ebook and as in Kindle. But and as an audiobook also. But in that book, I took all this pretty seriously, all the work
okay.
that had been done by early Black abolitionists on the Underground Railroad.
And another writers museum where your book was highlighted. I just put this in because I love this photo because it really shows how far we have not come in a way. Um, 1954, Brown versus Board. We segregated schools are not equal or not constitutional, and we've struggled all these years since, over 100 years or almost, to get integration. And these lovely children, I think they're in Ohio in the north. I can't go to school because of segregation. Our children play together. Why can't they learn together? I mean, I just think this photograph is so meaningful given our history.
Absolutely. Massachusetts was one of the first states to desegregate schools in the 1850s because black and white abolitionists fought for it. And it's really tragic that in the 1970s you had all that, as you probably know, having taught in Boston around that time, all that debate over school desegregation and busing. Here was the state that had pioneered desegregation, and then again those battles had to be fought anew. But education is a very important side for contesting rights in this country. It continues to be, I think, and equal education rights, as the Black abolitionists put it, in Boston, and their case was argued by the great Charles Sumner. That it remains an ongoing fight.
Yeah. Does that your parents?
That is my father, from whom I learned a love of history. And we are standing in New Delhi in front of India Gate. And I think this is just before I came to the United States. Yeah, I was leaving then. He was in the army. I told you he joined the British Indian Army, one of the first Indian officers in the British Army, and rose to be the Vice Chief of Army Staff. But he used to get up every day at 5 o'clock and write history. He wrote a lot of military history, and then when he retired, he got a grant from the Indian Historical Council to write a biography of one of the leaders of the 1857 revolt against the British. So he was writing history in his spare time, but he wrote more books than both my sister and me combined. And my sister teaches at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor right now. That's a later picture. My father unfortunately passed away in 2016, but and very suddenly, because he was quite fit, playing golf and doing his daily walks right up to the end. He passed away very suddenly, and I remember his last. He passed away in November, just a week before Trump was elected, and I remember one of his last words to me was, "Be careful that the United States doesn't become the United States of Trumpistan." And I thought that was pretty prescient of him, to say that. So it was a pretty dismal month for me.
That
That
your
also a picture with my father. We are at the Kaziranga Park, game park, which has these enormous herds of elephants and rhinoceros in Assam, which is a state in the northeast of India. After my father retired from the army, he was the governor of Assam and of Jammu and Kashmir, two Indian states. Um, in India, governors are not elected; they are appointed by the federal government. And he was sent to both those places. So he had a sort of career after he retired from the army. He was working until his mid 80s.
And this is a
Oh yeah, this is the entire family. My sisters, my brother who was a diplomat, and their children, me, my husband, and my older son. My younger son wasn't yet born then. He was born only in 2005. This was before that.
okay.
I'm amazed you have all these pictures, Sheila. I'm impressed.
Well, I researched some of your website and some articles that were written about you, and I think again the combination of the Indian history and your interest in American history is a wonderful combination. I think Americans don't appreciate what people from other cultures can bring to our history, and I probably read in places that you were even chastised or like how dare you a foreigner write about American history. I don't get that, but I'm sure you've gotten some of that too. I mean, it's just not right. It's anti-intellectual, which is a big disease in our country today, I believe, and people like you are contributing toward our education and very, very important. So I just want to end. I want you to tell me what you would most want to say to the educators of this country who are under siege, and there's no other way to say it. They are under siege. Their academic freedoms are at stake, and their personal freedoms and their lives are at stake. It's not an exaggeration. What would you say to them as a final thought?
I think educators in this country, especially our school teachers, are underpaid, underappreciated, and under siege now for what they teach. And I do a lot of history enrichment programs with school teachers across the country in Republican and Democratic states. And I would tell them to stand their ground because they are in a very honorable profession, a very old and honorable profession. And I wish they received more respect and more remuneration for what they do because I see what they do on a daily basis, even using their own salaries to buy supplies for their students because they're so committed to what they're doing. I would tell them to stand their ground. If they unite, I think they can fight these forces of reaction and these very cowardly political attacks on them.
All right. Well, Manisha, thank you so much for appearing today. And we only scratched the surface of your knowledge and expertise. So I really want to have a show with you talking about your books and what we can learn about the history of the civil rights movement, looking back through slavery, abolition, and Reconstruction. Very important and interesting issues that are being, in many ways, distorted today by what's happening in our country. So, thank you very much. And I'll tell everyone we'll see you next time on Talkback, and I'll let you know when Manisha will come on again. Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you so much for
Bye.
having me. Bye bye.
Thank